بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, as you know, Eid was just about 10 days ago. And even though we are quickly moving further and further away from Ramadan, the lessons of the month are still on my mind, and I hope lingering in yours as well. As you know, Ramadan is a great time for individual growth and development. It's a time that you can work on yourself. The opportunity that fasting presents to us provides us an avenue to become better believers, and this is done in a tremendous way. Being obliged to fast the entire month is something quite unique to the month. And during that time, there are many things that we hopefully learned. One of those, of course, is self-control. We control our desires like hunger and thirst. We learn how to be disciplined as we are refraining from food and drink. We polish our character. While fasting, we try to avoid being ill or foul, ugly with others. We also get a glimpse into the experience of those who are less fortunate than we are, perhaps dealing with food insecurity. And we gain a greater sense of appreciation for the many things that we do have, the great blessings that we enjoy on a day-to-day basis. We gain this sense of appreciation for the many opportunities that we're blessed with. And then, of course, we're encouraged to stay away from sin while fasting. And doing that, we hope to obtain higher and greater levels of iman and taqwa. Our faith and piety should grow. Fasting is very, very personal, and at times it could be considered a very private act of worship. And this is unlike the other forms of worship like prayer and charity, like making the pilgrimage and Hajj. Fasting can be hidden, unlike those other mentioned acts of worship. And for that reason, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, يَقُولُ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ الصَّوْمُ لِي وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ. He said that Allah, the Mighty and Majestic, said, the fast is for me, and I will be the one to reward for it. You find this in Sahih al-Bukhari. And what this means, according to the great Imams, like Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that one of the related meanings of this hadith, in that fasting is for Allah and He's the one that rewards it, is because fasting is very secretive in nature. And it's less likely to be subject to insincerity by way of showing off. Again, a person could hide the fact that they're fasting. They don't have to mention it, so they could avoid hypocrisy. People can see when you pray. They can witness your prayers. Even giving charity, the recipients of that charity know of your generosity. Even if you were to use a medium, a second party, someone's going to know that you donated. It can only be done in secret to such a degree. Your contribution will be felt and will be known. But fasting is something that you can conceal. And as personal as fasting is in the month of Ramadan, there is another very important element to that experience. A communal element in which you share yourself and your experience with others. We involve one another in Ramadan. And I'm not talking about what happens in the masjid. That's quite obvious. But what's perhaps most important is what happens in our own homes. We share Ramadan with our family members, with our spouse, and with our children. And hopefully during that month we worked as a team. Teamwork is necessary in Ramadan. Hopefully we were supporting each other in worship and helping each other achieve our respective Ramadan goals. We were waking up for suhoor together, hopefully cooking and doing the cleaning up together, dividing the chores, watching after the little ones for those that have young children, going out to the store for supplies, driving each other to the masjid or other places that were necessary, reminding one another to pray on time, to read the Quran, and to be generous. And for some of us, perhaps many of us sitting here today, we wouldn't be able to do what we did in Ramadan without the support of our family. And this is the kind of Ramadan that we could imagine our Prophet ﷺ having with his family, with his wives, and with his children. It's well known that the Prophet ﷺ, when he was at home, he assisted his family and served them. Was once asked of Aisha radiallahu anha, how was the Prophet ﷺ at home? And she said, كَانَ فِي مِحْدَةِ أَهْلِ فَإِذَا حَضَرَتِ الصَّلَاةُ قَامَ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. She said he used to keep himself busy serving his family. He used to keep himself busy while at home in the service of his family. And when it was time for prayer, he would get up and go to prayer. Some narrations said that when it was time for prayer, it was as if he forgot who they were. Meaning there was some priority in his life. And Allah was at the top of the list. But he did not forget his family. According to the great Ibn Hajar, this hadith encourages us, number one, to be humble. Because we're talking about the Prophet ﷺ, our beloved leader, a husband. And for many of us men, this is an encouragement to be humble, to serve your family. Also to abandon pride and ego, right? To serve oftentimes feels subservient in a way. And then of course it encourages us to take care of our duties as men, to serve our families. Not only did the Prophet ﷺ assist with some of the chores during Ramadan, much like he did throughout the year, but he included his family in worship. He didn't just leave them home to do the cooking and the cleaning and the rearing of the children, but he included them in worship, especially during the most important moments. Aisha radiallahu anha also narrated, she said, كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ إِذَا دَخَلَ الْعَشْرُ شَدَّ مِعْصَرَهُ وَأَحْيَا لَيْلَهُ. He said when the last 10 nights of Ramadan started, the Prophet ﷺ tightened his waist wrap and enlivened his nights, meaning he stayed awake at night, وَأَيْقَظَ أَهْلَهُ, and he would wake up his family. You find this hadith in Sahih Bukhari Muslim. And the very important part of this hadith, number one, is the narrator Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, who has first contact with him in those private moments at home. That's number one. Number two, she described him waking up his family, meaning waking up his wives, in order for them to pray. The hadith, it has numerous lessons for us to look at. And the most obvious is how important those last 10 nights of Ramadan are. And how the Prophet ﷺ would wake up his family, not so in order they would not miss that opportunity to pray. And there's another indication that's often overlooked and not discussed, especially in Ramadan. And that is when the Prophet ﷺ would tighten his waist wrap, shadda mi'zara, as Aisha, she said. And this expression is used, according to some, as a metaphor to mean that he would avoid intimacy with his wife in the last 10 days, or the last 10 nights, I should say. In the last 10 nights, he was busy with prayer. And the indication here is that the Prophet ﷺ would show them affection in the first 20 nights of Ramadan. Otherwise, there would be no reason to mention him doing that in the last 10, as if the standard was to avoid his wives completely throughout the month. But we can see that the Prophet ﷺ showed affection to his wives in that month. Not only during the night, when everything's permitted, but also it was reported that he showed affection during the day. And you find this in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. Aisha, again, reports, and she says, كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ يُقَبِّلُ وَيُبَاشِرُ وَهُوَ صَائِمٌ وَكَانَ أَمْلَكَكُمْ لِإِرْبِهِ. He said that the Prophet ﷺ used to kiss and embrace, meaning his wives. He would kiss them and he would hug them while he was fasting. And she said, and he, however, had the most control over his desires among you. meaning this is permissible, but you have to be careful. And the Prophet ﷺ illustrated this to show us that it was an important part of that Ramadan experience, that you maintain that communal, affectionate lifestyle with your family. So not only did he ﷺ engage in the individual worship of the month through his fasting and prayers, but he also included his family members in Ramadan by helping them in the house, helping them with the chores, serving them, and then, of course, encouraging his wives to pray voluntary prayers when it was most rewarding in the last 10 nights. In addition to that, he also maintained a level of love and warmth during a month which, for many marriages, can easily become very lonely and cold. And so if that's how the Prophet ﷺ spent his Ramadan, which we would consider the busiest month of the year in terms of worship and devotion, then you could only imagine how much he must have been engaged with his household during the other months of the year. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. In Surah An-Nisa, this is the first verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what means, O mankind, fear your Lord, who created you from one soul and created from it its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women. And fear Allah, through whom you have to ask of one another and whom you will be asked. Indeed, Allah is ever over you an observer. This verse, which is often recited on Fridays or other special occasions, reminds us of marriage. It reminds us specifically of Adam and his spouse, Hawa or Eve. You know, if you look at the explanation of this verse, you will find that the greats like Muhammad ibn Ishaq, Ibn Abbas, they relate that Hawa or Eve, she was created from the shortest left rib of Adam while he was sleeping. And then after some time, she was clothed with flesh and made whole. Adam, you see, was in Jannah all by himself and was rather lonely. You could imagine, many of you may have experienced this feeling, either before marriage or during marriage when the wife was gone, or for the sisters when the husband was absent. You begin to feel a sense of loneliness. And this was the experience of Adam in Jannah, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed him with, or blessed him with, his wife Hawa. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, be dutiful to your Lord who created you from a single person, Adam, and from him, from Adam, he created his wife Hawa, or Eve. And from them both he created many men and women. And this began the marriage. This began marriage and family. You can also find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَجَعَلَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا لِيَسْكُنَ إِلَيْهَا. He says in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 189, it is He who created you from a single person, meaning Adam, and then He created from him his wife, meaning Hawa or Eve, in order that he might enjoy the pleasure of living with her. This was the start of marriage. From the very first human being and the very second, they were made to be matches. This started marriage in our history and began the institutionalization of family. Because, as he says, they began to have children and they began to populate the earth. We find that throughout history that marriage has been the sunnah of the great men of God, the messengers and the prophets. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلًا مِّن قَبْلِكَ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَذُرِّيَّةً. He says, and we have already sent messengers before you and assigned to them wives and descendants. This is chapter 13, verse number 38. This particular verse, one of the great Imams, Al-Qurtubi, he said that it indicates the praiseworthy nature of marriage and the prohibition of celibacy, to remain celibate, meaning that you never get married ever. This was the practice of other religions. It also demonstrates that marriage was the way of the messengers before and the way of our messenger now, the messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged marriage regularly, saying, "Tazawwaju fa inni mukathirun bikum al-umam." He says, get married, for I will be the largest nation because of you. Get married, so that I will be the largest nation because of you. And in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is highlighting one of the fundamental goals of marriage. You see, marriage in Islam is considered a sunnah of life. It's a way of living. It's the way we were designed. And it's the only legitimate manner to have a relationship with the opposite gender. We don't have boyfriends and girlfriends and dating and hanging out and living together and then maybe making a commitment, but we get married. We come to a relationship honest and honorable. We make that commitment very early on, as was taught to us by our Prophet ﷺ. And most importantly, marriage, it serves to protect our chastity and to grow our lineage, as the Prophet indicated. And these are from the most essential aims of our legal code. And while marriage is generally encouraged, as many people know, its specific ruling is largely dependent on each individual situation. That's right. It depends on your circumstances as to what the ruling of marriage is, either being an obligation, recommendation, or something that is permissible, respectively being wajib or mustahab or mubah. Marriage. It's obligatory to get married for someone who is able to do so and fears that they will fall into illicit conduct and behavior. They fear that they will do something sinful. They're obliged to get married. Marriage is recommended for someone who has sensual desires, who is not afraid, like the first person, of committing illicit sexual activity. In this case, it's preferred, even over being free for voluntary worship. And then the last one is being simply permissible, meaning it's allowable, neither recommended nor obligatory, and this is for someone without desire, as the intent of marriage is to preserve one's chastity, to have children, and to increase their lineage. And in this third case, being free for voluntary worship is preferred over being married, because that person is likely to be unable to suffice their spouse in preserving their chastity. They're also likely to face obligations and rights they cannot fulfill, and in turn be distracted from seeking knowledge and worship, and this would be for something of no benefit. Regardless the case, brothers and sisters, marriage and family is the cornerstone of any community. Family and marriage is the cornerstone of any community, and the stronger the marriage and family structure is, the stronger the community will be. And because of that, I would like to spend the next several weeks going into some detail, dedicating some time to discussing the ways and means to creating lasting marriages and strong family bonds based on our faith, looking at the topic through the lens of the Quran and the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the meantime, we ask that Allah continue to pardon and to guide, to forgive us and to provide. We ask that He bless us with pious spouses and righteous offspring, that He keep us safe from those who seek to harm us, and that He liberate those who are oppressed around the globe. Allahumma yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana.